So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second webinar of our digitization series, Nominating Collections for Digitization. My name is Caitlin and I am the Special Collections Consultant here at the Northern New York Library Network. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping things before we get started. This session is being recorded and will be available to rewatch. You will receive the slides and the recording in an email. The recording will also be posted to our YouTube channel. If you have any questions as we go along, please feel free to put those in the Q&A section or the chat, and I'm going to be checking both of those to answer your questions when we kind of reach natural breaking points throughout the talk. And there will also be time left at the end to address questions. So if everyone's all set, let's get started. So first, I want to share a little bit of background of who I am and why I'm here talking to you about digitization. I grew up in Northern New York, in Franklin County, actually, and attended undergrad at SUNY Potsdam, where I found my love for local history. I then moved to Boston, where I earned my master's degree in library and information science, where I concentrated in archives management. Since then, I have been a practicing archivist, working at a number of institutions. My first job out of grad school, I was a photographer at the Northeast Document Conservation Center, where I learned a lot about cultural heritage photography and got to see collections from all across the country. Then I was a curator and archivist for a private historical society in Massachusetts. And being the only staff member for the collections, I wore many, many hats. I'm sure many of you do, which included setting up a digitization program from scratch. And you can see me trying to troubleshoot and work out some workflows on camera equipment in the photo in the slide. Most recently, before I moved back to New York, I was an academic archivist at Occidental College in California. I like to learn and stay up to date with the field. So this January, I became a certified digital archive specialist through the Society of American Archivists. And you may be wondering, what does that mean? I took a bunch of classes and exams to become more knowledgeable about how to care for digital files. I started with Nylon in July, and I'm very grateful to be here to support members with special collections. When I'm not at Nylon, I run my own business providing archival consultation and digitization services. So as a quick reminder of where we are in the series, we are on webinar 2 of 6, and these sessions have been designed to build on each other to develop policies, workflows, and skills for basic digitization and to have a basic program by the time we reach the end. They can be attended as the whole series, or if you just want to freshen up on maybe one skill, you're welcome to attend as many or few as you would like. Today, we're going to be talking about nominating collections for digitization and answering the big question, how do we choose what to digitize? In order to know what to choose, we're going to need to know a little bit about our institutions and the goals that they have. So we're going to start by talking about digital collection development policies, and then we're going to move on to the components of those policies, including the assessment and selection of materials. So as I mentioned, our big question for today is, how do we choose what to digitize? After all, it's likely not going to be feasible or necessary or worth your resources to digitize everything. So we're going to start with, what is a digital collection development policy? But before we answer this question, we're going to back up to more basic information about your institution. The chances are you have some kind of guiding documentation that tells you why your institution exists, what it does. Maybe this exists in some kind of a charter or a mission statement. Now I'm going to take a stab in the dark and assume that based on this institutional purpose or mission, that you have some kind of guideline to know what you do and what you don't do. For example, if you're a museum who is capturing the functions and history of a community, chances are you're not also paving driveways. Like, extreme example, I know, but there's very defined functions of what you do and what you don't do. Similarly, you also have an idea of what you collect and what you don't collect, even if you don't have something written down as formal as a collection policy. So a collection policy, the formal definition is up on the slide, but it is a written document that outlines some ground rules of what kinds of materials you collect and aligns with the mission of your institution. So the purpose of why your institution exists, what you do. It also likely lays out the selection process of how you decide what you're going to collect. Now, you may be asking yourself, why do I need a collection policy? I know what we take and what we shouldn't take, which fair enough. But a collection policy can actually be a really, really great tool to help you. First, they give you backup. If there's a donor that's insisting that you take something, it's a lot easier to point to a policy or documentation that already exists and is concrete to back yourself up as to why something does or doesn't meet your criteria. So you don't have to make up those choices on the fly. Documentation also is going to allow you to be consistent in your decision making. And this actually is going to lead me to my next 2 points, is it provides clear documentation of how decisions are made at your institution, and it allows consistency in decision making even as your staff changes. Even if the policy is amended as you go, or if there's changes in your strategic direction, you'll have clear documentation to know how decisions were made at certain points in time. Finally, having a thought out purpose for your program and selection allows you to curate and care for your collections much, much more intentionally. So now we've talked about what a collecting or collection policy is. We're going to get into the digital piece of this. So it functions really in the same ways that a collection policy does, except it's specifically about digital materials, acting as that guideline that establishes what your program does, its purpose, what responsibilities exist, and who is administering the program, and what kinds of things you're going to collect, and how that aligns with what your institution does. This document can be formal, perhaps approved by a governing board or body, or it can also exist as an informal document. If it is more informal, some institutions choose to label it as a strategy instead of a policy, or I'm sure you could come up with some other creative word that you wanted to use if you really wanted to. The nice thing about the informal version or strategy is that it's usually easier to edit and adapt since it doesn't have to go through a formal approvals every time a change is made. To make things easier for today, as we talk about this, I'm just going to refer to this as a policy for today. A digital collection development policy may stand alone and be its own document. It also may be a section that's within your general collection policy that includes the physical collections. Then you have a part about how you handle digital content. But the key takeaways here is that it's something that's written down and that you can apply consistently. So depending on what your institution does, what your goals are, how big or small you are, and a multitude of other factors, what is included inside your policy may vary in what level of detail you cover. Today, we're going to focus on 3 components. So we have organizational overview, digital collection strategy, and selection criteria. So each of these components is going to serve as one section of this policy or the document that we're going to talk about making. We're going to go through each of these sections individually to see what kind of components make them up. If you want to create a policy like this on your own, I want to remind you that the slides and the recording are going to be available, so you're not trying to furiously take notes as I talk and as we walk through these sections. The slides will also contain recommended resources at the very end, which is going to have example policies that I highly, highly recommend that you take a look at. It's a really great way to get ideas of what others are doing, and you can kind of snatch pieces that work for you and tweak things. So it's really a nice starting point to wrap your head around what other people are doing and what you might want to do at your institution. All right, before we jump into component 1, does anyone have any questions that you'd like to drop in the chat or Q&A? Okay, there will be more time at the end as well. So seeing none, I'm going to keep going. So section one is we're gonna talk about the organizational overview, or I'm kind of calling it like your self-assessment section, because it's gonna capture information about your institution. So we're gonna ask questions like, why does your organization exist? Who does it serve? What are you already doing? And what kinds of materials do you collect? The good news is that this is information that hopefully is already captured somewhere. Hopefully you'll be able to do a lot of copy and pasting for this part of your document. The goal here is that we're going to gather information about what your organization already does to ensure that your new or updated digital program is going to align with it. We're going to look at three factors within this section today: your institutional mission, your institutional vision and goals, and your current collecting strategies. So we're going to start with your organization's purpose or its mission. So this is most commonly seen as a written mission statement, which articulates your institution's educational focus, purpose, and role, as well as its responsibilities to the public and the collections that you have. So this statement is often seen as the heart of an organization. It portrays the reason for existence and drives every other decision and direction that the institution takes. Mission statement is made of three main elements. So I'm going to call them the what, the how, and for who. So the example that you see on the slide in the blue box is the mission statement of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. If we look at this more closely, we can find those three elements that I just mentioned. So it reads, empowering people to create a just and compassionate future by exploring, preserving, and sharing the complexity of our past. So first, our what question. What are they doing? So we can see that they're empowering to create a just and compassionate future. How are they doing this? And then we can see by looking at this statement, by exploring, preserving, and sharing. And then they talk about, they're kind of pointing to things from the past. And then who is it for? And the Smithsonian's is very, very broad in that their community is just people, whoever from all walks of life. It's likely that if you're here today, that you are at an institution that already has its mission statement or its purpose. So as I mentioned, this is a great element that you can just copy and paste into that digital collection policy to ensure that you stay rooted in those origins and make decisions driven by the main reason that you exist in the first place. So up next are your institutional goals. So what this is called can vary from institution to institution. It could be a strategic plan, long-term goals, a long-range plan, but the concept is all the same. Does your institution have long-term goals that they are trying to achieve? Does your institution have agreed upon values? Sometimes you can see this written as a value statement or some kind of aspirational direction of what they want their future to look like. And this is often called a vision statement if it exists more formally. How can the program that you are building or working on align with those institutional goals? You will be a lot more likely to gain support for the work that you're doing if you can support goals at that institutional level and show administration which values or goals you can support and how you're doing that. These documents are often created by administration if your institution has them. Hopefully you can be able to find them, get access to them, and then read through them and copy and paste the points that you can address through your work, and make some notes about how you align with what those goals are. You'll likely have to think a little bit broadly, maybe be a little bit creative when working on this task to make some of those connections. Some will be easier than others. The third element within that self-assessment or looking at what your organization's already doing is related to your current collecting strategies or policies. So what do you collect and why? At the beginning of today, we talked about how something more formal, like a collecting policy, may already exist. And if so, that's great. And you can probably copy and paste all or parts of that out to help yourself. If you don't have something written down, that's okay too. This could be a really good opportunity to take time to write those things down and write down what you do know about how decisions are made about what you collect. If you have other people at your institution to weigh in on this, it'd be a great time to kind of pick brains and add to the list. If you need to define your collecting strategy or make that list, what should you write down? We want to define what the collecting scope of your institution is. What do you collect? And just as importantly, what don't you collect? What do you hope to collect in the future? Defining this scope sets boundaries about the subject areas, themes, geographic regions, or topics that you will collect that align with that mission or purpose of your institution. And this is going to help you care for your objects, work with donors, and sets you apart from other institutions. So, as an example, if I'm an institution preserving history in Potsdam, New York, and of Potsdam, New York, I'm going to be looking to collect materials that are related to people, businesses, activities, etc., that took place or are taking place or related to Potsdam. So in this case, my institution's main collecting strategy or boundary, if we're looking at the list on the slide, is related to geography. No matter how cool or interesting material is, if it's coming from a different place, say maybe Buffalo, as cool as it might be, I'm not going to be the right place to collect that. But there probably is a more appropriate institution who does collect things about Buffalo who's going to want that item. All right, so that wraps up kind of the three elements of looking at our own organizations and what they're already doing. Does anybody have any questions at this point? All right, we're going to move on to the second section. So our section number 2 is going to be about our new program or updated, whatever stage you're at, for our digital collections or digitization in the course of focus of this webinar. So this section's goal is going to be to capture that information about the decisions that are going into this program that we are going to be running specifically related to digital materials. And we want to document the purpose of the program, who is going to be responsible for what components of it, and identify what the goals of the program are. If this is your first time addressing digital content, you're likely going to have to draft this section. If you already have an existing program, you might be able to kind of copy and paste and steal pieces and maybe amend what changes you might want to make. As we go through this section, you're going to see I've provided some guiding questions to help us think through the narrative or the bullets that you may want to define for this section. I'm also going to take this opportunity to remind you that there will be that recommended resource slide at the end where you can see policies with examples of what types of elements you may want to be thinking about and how you may want to word things for these sections and adapt them to fit what you're doing. And as I mentioned, as with the rest of the series, our focus is going to be on digitization or turning those physical items you have into digital representations. But these guiding factors can also be broadened to include born digital materials or files that are made from an electronic device originally. So it can be helpful for what we're applying directly, but also for broader things as well. So the first kind of piece of this section that we're going to talk about is defining the purpose of our digital collecting or our digitization program in our case. I've written a few guiding questions to think through when we're creating the narrative for this part. Why are you creating a digitization program? What will your organization do with digital collections? And who will the program serve? How will it serve them? So much like our mission statement, this is kind of defining that purpose of existence, but specifically for a digitization program. So on the slide, you can see an example of a program's purpose statement from the University of Richmond's library. And I have bolded some of the key components of their purpose. And as I mentioned, much like that mission statement, it's going to address what's being done, why, how, and for who. So the library says that they will create and preserve and provide access to digital content and collections. So that's what they're doing. Then to support teaching and research. So that tells us the why. Why are they doing it? To support teaching and research. And for who, they're saying they're doing this at the university. They also go on to add that they will make materials publicly accessible and digitize and preserve content. So to me, this is kind of telling us a little bit of the how. So like we know that they're going to give that access because they're digitizing and preserving content. So it's a little bit of what and how maybe, but so they address all of that in this very succinct little paragraph, much like a mission statement. So the next part of this digital program strategy that we're going to look at is now that we've established what the purpose of the program is, our next task is going to be to figure out who's going to be in charge of administering it. And this can be as informal or formal as an institution decides. It is good, however, to make sure there's some kind of a point person, staff member, committee chair, someone who is intentionally keeping an eye on it to make sure the program is existing, running. So again, here's some guiding questions that you may want to consider. So who's will oversee or manage the program and how? How will you know that you are doing what you set out to do? What are the key points that need decisions to be made in the program? Then you may want to go a step farther to point out who is going to make these decisions and how. Will some kind of a board vote on it? Is one person hold all the power to make the decision that this can happen? And will one person have the power to decide that or be voted on? And the example on this slide, which is another one from the University of Richmond, we can see that they have assigned certain tasks to certain roles. So selection and prioritization is to be determined by the digital collections librarian in consultation, and then they list some other staff members. Now, a lot of us, at least where anywhere that I have worked, does not have a multi-person staff structure. But you may have a board, volunteer panel, or maybe even just that one single staff member who you want to make sure has control over, or at least knowledge of what's happening. So you may want to define that role. I do want to point out that I really love the way that this example was written because it defines those responsibilities in terms of roles at the institution and not by individual people or not named individuals. So this to me is going to keep things really, really clear and hopefully running smoothly, especially if there's staff turnover, because you still know the role that should be handling those tasks. And the third element of our digital collection strategy section is program aspirations. And I saw this in some example policies that I was looking at and not others. So I'm flagging this the little asterisk because I'm going to flag it as being optional. But I do think it's a good idea and at least a good exercise to think through, even if you don't write it down. But if you're going through the work, you might as well write it down. So program aspirations are much like the vision or value statement in that it's setting forth goals for your program to aspire to or align with. So these goals could be to uphold certain standards or best practices of the field or aspirations of what responsibilities you're agreeing to take on by creating this program in the first place. So guiding questions that you may want to ask are things like, what promises do you want to make to your institution and community for the care of digital materials? What quality are you hoping to achieve and uphold? And what kind of access are you hoping to provide? As another example, this one is from FIT. I just grabbed a few that I thought are maybe more applicable. But some that they pointed out was they want to provide long-term maintenance of digital materials and viability of the repository. So this is stating their long-term goals and commitment to maintaining the materials for future discovery and use. They also state that they want to adhere to and design systems that are in compliance with standards and best practices. And I think it's really nice that they actually go a step further and say who those authorities are that they're looking to for guidance and to align with on these issues. So they list the Library of Congress and New York State Archives. So having defined a purpose and a plan will not only help you better understand your program, it's also going to help you share it with others. Having a formalized plan to point to and share can often make it easier to support the work that you're doing and get others to support you. So before I move to our third and final policy section, are there any questions about defining your digital program? All right, well, keep moving. So our third and final section is going to go back to that key question we asked the very, very beginning of the talk. So how do we choose what to digitize? Everything we've talked about up until now, so your institution's guiding principles, that the mission, the vision, your collecting scope, as well as that new digital program outline that we just defined with its own set of goals, aspirations. Those are all going to inform what you choose to digitize. But additionally, there's certain characteristics of the materials themselves that we have in our collections that we're going to use to help us choose what we want to prioritize. So I've identified 5 categories to talk about today as examples, which we'll step through each one. However, based on your organization, you may want to add additional or more specific criteria. So this is kind of a brainstorming starting space, but definitely not comprehensive. So the first thing we're going to consider is the legal status. Do you have clear ownership of the materials? Do you know the copyright status of the materials, or is it all a little bit of a mystery? Good candidates for digitization are going to be materials that you know a lot about and that you have ownership or rights to use. If you can say yes to the bullets that are next to the green check marks, then those are going to likely be really good candidates for digitization. So as I mentioned, clear ownership of the material. You know what the copyright status is. The materials are in the public domain, and the material is owned by your organization. So this may even be like publications that your organization made. So it's very clear that you have permission to use it. If your materials fall more in that red category of bullets, though, these are materials you're going to want to be more hesitant about. So if you don't know the copyright status, if you don't have documentation that shows ownership or transfer of the material to you, if the material is not in the public domain, or if the materials have restrictions, maybe by a donor agreement or maybe by some other privacy, some other means. Then these are not likely going to be very good candidates for digitization without some further research or without getting some of those questions answered. So factor number 2 or criteria number 2 that we want to consider is the condition of the collection itself. So we were talking about how much do you know about the legal status of the collections. Now we want to know how much do we know about the collection itself? Where did it come from or its provenance? And who has it changed hands between over time? This is also sometimes called the chain of custody. Has the collection been processed or organized in some meaningful way to know what is in it? Have the materials been described? Again, this is to help us understand what it contains. So the real big question is, do you know what you have? If we know how the materials came to exist and they're organized and we know what's in them, then they're likely a pretty good candidate for digitization, like the pretty organized box you see in the right-hand picture on this slide. However, if your materials look more like the box on the left, and we all have them, they're kind of full of all unknowns, in need of a lot of love and some care to know what's really going on, then it's likely that they need some more research and work before it's going to get put into the line to be digitized. So consideration number 3 is the content of the material itself. So what are they about? I have included images on this slide of my grandparents' wedding scrapbook to use as an example to talk through, just because I thought it would be fun. So looking at our green check mark of what we're looking for criteria, is this material unique or rare? So check yes, I can say yes to that because this is the only scrapbook that exists about their wedding. Is this material historically significant? How important is it in the context of, in this case, my family collections or my family history? And the answer to that is that it is super important. Is actually the only surviving documentation of their wedding and or honeymoon, since no photographs of the wedding itself have survived. It also contains handwriting samples and some images of other family members, which provide context for other research. So when it comes to historic significance, you are going to be the expert at your institution for what your organization or region's history is. And chances are you're already considering this factor when you're deciding whether to accept donations or not. So you are the experts. It's your place on that topic. So the next question is the material complete? Do we have enough to understand the context of what it is or what it's about? So lucky for me, the answer again is yes. I have the entire scrapbook, which includes clippings, writings, newspapers, labeled images, cards, and other fun things. Now, if I only had one page, I may not have been able to figure out what it was or who it was about. So that may have deprioritized it, if that were the case. But luckily, I have the whole thing. Is the material visually appealing? This factor can help you decide what to digitize, particularly for digital collections. What might catch people's eye, draw attention, draw interest. It may also be a factor of research interest due to aesthetic appeal. Certain people like to research certain types of formats, such as photographs. So this is not a sole factor, but it's one that could contribute to what you may want to pick. So in this case, it's pretty visually appealing. It has photographs. It has these fun little cards from the wedding shower. So I get to say yes again. So another question of consideration, which I didn't tie to the scrapbook, but I want to bring up, is if your material is representing hidden or underrepresented voices. So if the answer to any of these questions is yes, you likely have a really good candidate for digitization. If the materials are held by another institution, are duplicated even within your own collections, or are already available online somewhere, then chances are you don't likely, maybe not worth your time to or resources to digitize those things. So the fourth factor of consideration is the physical condition of the material. So what condition are the original materials in? Have they been stabilized, rehoused, and cared for? So our number one priority always, and you're gonna hear me get on my soapbox and say this 1,000 times if you attend multiple of these webinars, but our priority is always, always, always the safety of our collections. We do not want to cause damage to them. We want to keep them in the best state that we can to preserve them for the future. even if extra steps have to be taken to do that. So some objects may actually need conservation care before they can get imaged. Items need to be able to lie flat in order to produce the best digital image. Items that are curled, folded, or warped may need careful consideration or to be stabilized by a conservator before they are ready for their camera debut. So you can see on the slide, we have some negatives that are curled. That's not going to make a good picture. And depending on what situation is going on, they may not even be able to lay flat safely without cracking to be digitized. So these are things that we want to think about as we're looking through our collections. So if you can answer yes to the following questions, then you may have a really good candidate for digitization. So is it difficult to retrieve the object for use because of where it is stored or the size of the material? So materials that are really large require multiple people to handle, like that might be, but people want to look at, that may be a good thing to get digitized to make access easier. Is the material fragile or vulnerable to damage from repetitive use? So this may be a case where it's best to digitize it once, and then you can provide that access without having the pages, say, of a fragile scrapbook be turned over and over and over again. Are the materials stored on unstable media? For example, my scrapbook, the black scrapbook pages, the newspaper, those are all very highly acidic. So over time, I know that that is going to break down and become more brittle with the passage of time. So it's probably something that I want to take care of before it destroys itself. If your materials are on either end of the spectrum, so they really need conservation to be handled safely, or they're in really, really good stable condition, then you may wait to digitize either because it needs attention or because you have time to get that digitization done and maybe something else has more of a priority. So that's weighs into what you're thinking about as far as where in the queue it gets put. Another physical factor that may prevent you from prioritizing material for digitization is material with what's called high intrinsic value. So intrinsic value is the usefulness or the significance of the material because of its actual physical form or that original form that it exists in. And this is not thinking about the content of it. And so the thought is that if it's important, it has high value because of the physical form that it is in, then that could be lost in reproduction. So an example of this is currency. So if you have historic coins in your collection, say, you could digitize them and you could capture the information that's printed on them, so the little emblem and maybe the year it was printed. But it's likely that the reason that you're keeping these coins is not just because of the date that's stamped on them or some property like that. So the significance of that is partially the object itself, and that's represented in that physical piece. So there are some qualities that you just can't capture on a camera. Maybe you do still want some kind of version of documentation of them though. So another thing to think about as you're looking at your collections is why are you doing it? What matters? So our final factor of selection for our criteria is potential use. So if the materials are in high demand for research, underutilized, but could have high use value if they were known. So maybe you have some collection you haven't got to process yet, nobody knows exists, but you know once it was out there, it has a lot of historical significance or a lot of interest from scholars for to be used. If they are materials that resonate with your community, or if they support other functions of your organization. So maybe educational programming, outreach, and maybe exhibits, then those would all be really good reasons to maybe want to digitize something. If your materials don't really meet any of these functions, then they're likely not as high of a priority to get digitized. So again, if they're already available online, if you don't really see or anticipate them to be able to support other functions that you're doing, if they're only going to resonate with a very few members of the community, not the majority, you probably are going to want to start where you can get the most traction, get the most interest, so that you can kind of drive up excitement about your program and get support to keep doing more things. So to help evaluate your materials, it may be helpful to turn the factors, all those factors we talked about, in the good and the green and the red check mark, and consider turning them into some kind of a rubric that could be included as a template within your policy. That way you can evaluate each collection against the criteria. For example, if you were to check yes to multiple criteria and multiple categories on in this example, then that means it would be a strong candidate for digitization. Okay, any questions there before I keep going? All right, we're nearing the end anyway, so I'll catch you there. So before we wrap up for today, here are a few other components that you may wish to address in your digital collection development policy. You may want to acknowledge or evaluate your institution's resources, its infrastructure and staffing, and what could be allocated to digital projects specifically. You may also want to include other policies and procedures that exist at your institution that will play a role in your digital program, such as copyright, permissions, and licensing. There may be rules higher up the chain than your specific department, that you have certain ways that you need to react to, that's governed by another power. So you may want to just have a note of that and that it exists and what you need to do. You may also want to include other related policies and procedures outside of copyright permissions, things like that, that are either come from your institution, region, state, any other kind of body that would affect the work that you're doing, and raise concerns or restrictions or protections. If you're in a hospital, there's certain health protocols you have to abide by. In a school, there's certain educational things. So anything that could kind of play into your program, you may decide that you want to note it so everything's in one place. As I've mentioned, it's extremely helpful to look at other examples by other institutions. I suggest you shop around and use what you like the most and what's applicable to your institution and situation. I highly recommend that you look at institutions that are both like and unlike your own, either in size and collecting scope, but especially size. So you can get your own ideas and scale it to what suits your needs. So let's review what we talked about today. So we talked about digital collection development policies, kind of what they are and why we might want one. Then we also talked about the three main sections that you would want to have in your policy if you're going to write one and have one at your institution. So this included that self-assessment or the overview of your organization, what it already can do and what it supports. A strategy for your digital program. So, what's the purpose? Why are you making this? Who's going to be in charge? What's it going to do? And who is it going to serve? And finally, that criteria to select what are you going to digitize? What are those factors that you want to check to see if it's going to be a good candidate or bad, and where you want to rank it and prioritize it within all the materials that you want to work on. So now, if you're feeling overwhelmed, which I really hope you're not, here's a moment to remember to start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. You're making your institution a better place bit by bit, and that's all that matters. And we all have to start somewhere. So if you would like to join me again, the next session is going to be on November 7th. So it's preparing for digitization, where we're going to talk about more details. So it's more planning, but instead of talking about the program as a whole existing, this is going to be more of the nitty-gritty planning of what are your in-house capabilities for equipment, staff, time, space, those kinds of things, as well as what kind of quality do you want to achieve. So we're actually going to look at some guidelines that come down from federal agencies and figure out how we can use pieces of those to try to align ourselves with what we are capable of to get a good quality product that aligns with that program goals that we're setting out. So you can use the QR code on the next slide to find the registration links for all of the webinars. And if they're not all there yet, they will be very soon. You can also find them by going to our website, which is nyln.org. So thank you so much for joining me today.